Everyone. Thanks for your patience. We're going to get started right now. And welcome to today's webinar, Can My Business Be a Nonprofit? Before I introduce our guest speaker, I just wanted to briefly share how we'll be spending our time together, besides fixing technical issues. We're going to start the first half of the hour on a slide presentation from our guest speaker, and then roughly the last portion we will go ahead and answer your questions, and you can enter those in the Q&A chat box. We've reserved microphone capabilities for the moderator and presenter only, and you can download the slide deck in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. Today's presentation will be recorded and posted for future review at GrantSpace.org. I suspect some of you might be new to us and what we do. The Foundation Center is a national nonprofit organization, and our mission is to strengthen the social sector by advancing knowledge about philanthropy in the United States and around the world. And one way we accomplish our mission is through educating thousands of people each year through a full curriculum of training courses in the classroom and online. We offer free and affordable classes nationwide that cover the funding research process, proposal writing, grant makers and their giving, and just a whole host of topics related to the social sector. And of course, another way we accomplish our mission is through connecting nonprofits through our online community portal, GrantSpace, and you'll be able to find a recording of today's session to share with your colleagues at GrantSpace.org. I also just wanted to put a plug because we have another webinar coming up next Thursday, March 6th, on Lean for Social Good 101. It's a nice match to today's webinar because if you're looking at figuring out how to start a business or start a nonprofit for good, using lean principles, this will kind of get you started, and that's at 11 a.m. next Thursday, March 6th. Again, that's free. So let's get started. Please join me in welcoming today's guest speaker, Erin Broderick. She's senior counsel at Neo Law Group and also a contributor to the nonprofit law blog. And Erin is now in her 7th year of practice. She really focuses on corporate and tax matters for nonprofit and exempt organizations. Prior to joining the Neo Law Group, Erin was a litigation associate with the law firms Simpson, Thatcher, and Bartlett. She worked on a broad range of complex commercial litigation matters, including antitrust actions, foreign sovereign debt disputes, and securities litigation, and so much more. Please join me in welcoming Erin. Thank you, Erin.
Thank you, Sarah Jo, and thank you to the Foundation Center for having me today. Again, apologize for the delay that we've had, and thank you all for your patience and for participating in the poll. It's interesting to see that the majority of you are considering launching a new business venture and you're not sure whether to make it a for-profit or a nonprofit. So we'll try to focus on that today as we go through the presentation. So it won't come as a surprise to any of you that nonprofit organizations are currently facing significant financial challenges. And in response to decreased funding from traditional sources, nonprofits are looking for ways in which to increase fundraising, and many are turning to earned income business ventures that may look more like for-profit activity than traditional nonprofit activity. At the same time, for-profit companies are also operating in an increasingly competitive market, and many are seeking to differentiate themselves and to generate goodwill with the public by identifying themselves as charitably motivated or as sustainable businesses. As this happens, we're seeing a blurring in the differences of the activities of nonprofit and for-profit organizations. And many people who are thinking of starting new organizations, such as yourselves, are wondering whether they should form nonprofit or a for-profit business. And that's what I'll be focusing on mostly in today's webinar. So I'm going to start by giving a little bit of background information and going through several examples, and we'll make sure to leave some time at the end for any questions that you may have. I apologize, that slide seems to be missing somehow, but Okay, well, what you would see is that when we talk about a nonprofit and when we talk about a tax-exempt organization, we're actually talking about two separate concepts. So nonprofit is actually a term that stems from state corporate law, and it refers to a business form of an entity that has no owners and makes no distribution to its owners. Now, being a nonprofit doesn't necessarily mean that you're tax-exempt. Tax-exempt as a phrase actually refers to a concept of federal and state tax law, and it's a status that an organization can obtain, usually by applying for tax exemption with the IRS and with the state organization. And it allows that organization to be exempt from certain corporate income taxes on certain income. Now, for purposes of this presentation, when I refer to a nonprofit organization, I'm referring to a nonprofit corporation that is tax exempt under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code and is recognized as a public charity as opposed to a private foundation. So I'll be talking about nonprofits that are tax exempt when I say nonprofit. And when I refer to a charitable purpose in this presentation, I'm referring to all exempt purposes under Section 501c3. Which includes educational, religious, scientific, and other qualifying purposes in addition to charitable. But I'll use the term charitable to kind of cover all of those. So let's say you're in that third category and you're thinking of starting a venture. And you have charitable intentions and you want your organization or your business to do good in some way, but you're not sure if it's best suited for a nonprofit or a for-profit entity. How do you go about deciding? Well, some of the initial considerations you're going to want to think about are whether you actually have a viable idea. Now, obviously, this is going to be important regardless of whether you think you're going to start a nonprofit or a for-profit. You want to think about whether you're duplicating something that's already out there, or if the organization is actually providing something different than services or goods that are already being provided. You want to know what your competition is going to be. And if the organization is offering something new, you'll want to make sure that it's also not offering something in a geographic area where that services is already being provided. You want to know where your competition is geographically located, and if you're going to provide something new to the community, or if the community that you're going to be operating in is already being served. You might also want to consider if there are any potential opportunities for collaboration with an existing business or an existing nonprofit. You also want to think about whether you have a sustainable business plan, and whether you've developed a realistic budget. And again, this is going to be important regardless of whether you think you'll form a for-profit or a nonprofit. But if you do decide to form a nonprofit and you apply for tax exemption with the IRS is going to require you to provide a 3-year projected budget on the Form 1023. So it's a good idea to make sure that you have that in place before you begin the organization. You also want to think of where the initial funding for the business is going to come from. Do you need access to traditional institutional investors? If so, then a for-profit may be a more appropriate form because many traditional investors will not be interested in investing in a nonprofit due to the fact that the nonprofit can't provide returns. And alternatively, if you need access to foundation grants or certain government contracts or charitable donations, they may not be available to a for-profit, and a nonprofit may make more sense. The bottom line, though, of what you want to think about is sustainability. Do you have an idea that's sustainable over the long run, and do you have a business plan that can support that? Once you've considered those things, you also want to consider whether you have the capacity to launch this business. Now, when we talk about capacity, we're talking about financial resources, so that initial funding and whether you're going to be able to attract it, and also whether you're going to be able to attract long-term funding to keep the business running. But we're also talking about other resources, including human resources, systems resources, technology, time, administrative resources, and space. The bottom line in considering all of these things, though, should be a focus on sustainability and making sure that you really can launch a sustainable business or nonprofit organization. So if you think you have a viable business idea and you have the capacity to make it sustainable, how do you decide whether the business should be a nonprofit or a for-profit? The first thing you're going to want to consider is what the mission of the business is. What's your priority? What's your main purpose in launching this business? Is the main purpose to make you money, or is the main purpose to provide charitable goods and services? And obviously, main purpose might fall somewhere on that continuum, and it doesn't necessarily have to be one or the other. But under Section 501c3, an organization needs to be formed exclusively for an exempt purpose, such as the ones I mentioned earlier, charitable, religious, scientific, educational, or others. So for a nonprofit, the purpose shouldn't be to create a job for yourself or for someone you know, or to make lots of money. If the mission is exclusively charitable for your business, then you have the option of either forming the organization as a for-profit or a nonprofit. On the other hand, if the mission is not exclusively charitable, then you might more properly structure it as a for-profit. So if your mission is exclusively charitable, your next consideration should be whether the activities of the organization that you're contemplating are primarily related to that exempt purpose or that charitable purpose. Under Section 501c3, an exempt organization must be operated primarily for one or more exempt purposes, and only an insubstantial part of its activities may be devoted to non-exempt purposes. So this means that you need to think about whether the main activities of your organization are going to be related to your charitable purpose. And if they are, again, you have the option of forming a for-profit or a nonprofit. On the other hand, if they aren't, then a for-profit might be a more appropriate structure. So for nonprofits, there are also some other requirements that apply under Section 501c3 that you'll want to consider that won't apply to for-profits. The first is that a nonprofit cannot provide a private benefit. This means that the nonprofit must serve a public rather than a private interest, and it can't be operated for the benefit of private interests. Now, nonprofits can confer benefits on individuals if they're incidental, both quantitatively and qualitatively, to furthering the organization's exempt purposes. So, for example, you could pay a reasonable salary to an individual working for the organization, but providing that private benefit can't be the primary purpose of the organization. This is obviously in contrast to a for-profit that doesn't have this same limitation. A second limitation that applies to nonprofits under Section 501c3 is that they cannot provide any private inurement. This means that no part of the net earnings of the nonprofit may inure to the benefit of any private shareholder or individual. And again, this is in contrast to for-profits, which often make dividend payments to their shareholders, or where profits often inure to the owner of the for-profit. This means you can't provide as a nonprofit an unjust enrichment or a disproportionate benefit. Basically, you can't give more to your officers or directors or any individual than they deserve in return for services that they've rendered or for doing nothing. And this is important to know because the penalty for providing a private inurement is really strict. It's the loss of exempt status for the organization. So it's something that the organization wants to be aware of and you want to make sure that you can comply with. Now, if these restrictions don't sound compatible with your business idea, it may be that a for-profit structure is more appropriate. There are also a few other considerations you want to keep in mind if you're thinking of possibly starting a nonprofit. You want to consider whether the business activity that you're considering engaging in is related to your exempt purposes, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. This means that it must be directly related, and not merely that the proceeds will be used to support the organization's charitable activities. You also have to think about what the basis for exemption is for your particular organization. Because just because the activity may qualify as exempt if it's carried on by some organization, doesn't mean it necessarily aligns with your organization's basis for exempt status. So if you determine that the activities are in fact related, the business activities you want to engage in are in fact related to your exempt purposes, you should ask whether it's a prudent investment or whether it's a thoughtful and defensible risk-taking move. The board of directors of a nonprofit has a duty to use nonprofits' funds responsibly and consistently with the exempt purposes of the organization. There's also the issue of the unrelated business income tax, which is also called UBIT. And under UBIT, if an activity is unrelated to a nonprofit's exempt purposes, income from the activity may be subject to tax at the normal corporate rate, which means that the income from those activities may not provide the tax advantage of running the activity in a nonprofit in the first place. Now, if the activity isn't related, then you need to ask if it's substantial. If it's a substantial part of the overall activities that the nonprofit will be engaging in. If the business activity is unrelated to the organization's exempt purpose and is a substantial amount of its overall activities, then they may cause the organization to fail the operational test that I discussed a few minutes earlier that requires a nonprofit to be operated primarily for its exempt purposes, which means that it may lose or not qualify for its exempt status. And again, a nonprofit can only engage in an insubstantial amount of unrelated activities. So this is something that you're going to want to keep in mind. Now, if the business activities are a substantial amount of the activities of the overall organization, one option may be to put them into a subsidiary rather than running them as an internal program. Now, if you do have substantial unrelated business activities in a nonprofit, and you're debating whether to create them as an internal program of the nonprofit or as a subsidiary, here are a few things you might want to keep in mind. You might want to consider cultural compatibility, whether the new activities are actually compatible with the existing nonprofit or the other activities the nonprofit plans to engage in, and whether there are going to be any PR consequences if the nonprofit engages in these additional activities internally. You also might want to think about whether there's a different organizational purpose, whether it makes sense to put the activities in a subsidiary from a risk management perspective. For instance, if the new activities have a higher risk profile than activities that are otherwise conducted in the nonprofit, you might want to separate them out into a subsidiary in order to protect the parent company from liability stemming from those activities. You might also want to take into consideration geographic considerations, employee considerations, protection of the parent's tax exemption if the separate activities are going to be too large and could threaten the tax-exempt status of the parent organization, access to equity capital. If it can't be accessed by a nonprofit, it might make sense to place it into a for-profit subsidiary, and operational flexibility. Now, if you've gone through the considerations we just discussed and you think your organizational activity properly fits within a nonprofit structure, but you're still not sure if you're ready to form a standalone organization quite yet, you may want to consider some alternatives to forming a standalone nonprofit. Those might include working with an existing nonprofit, creating a donor-advised fund, which is a tax-deductible donation that's made to an organization, typically a community foundation or a financial company, where the donor provides advice on how he or she would like to see the funds used. Technically, the organization receiving the donations is not obliged to distribute the funds as advised by the donor, although they still must be used consistently with the purpose of the fund, but not doing so could create PR problems for the donor-advised fund, so typically they do follow the advice of donors. A third option is a giving circle, which is where a group of donors pool their intended gifts into a combined fund and collectively decide where to invest those funds. The advantage of using a giving circle is that the group may be able to have larger impact by acting collectively. And a final alternative is fiscal sponsorship. Now, fiscal sponsorship is not a legally defined term, but in its most common form, which is referred to as Model A comprehensive fiscal sponsorship, it's where an organization that already has 501c3 exempt status agrees to house the charitable project as one of its own. So legally, under Model A fiscal sponsorship, the sponsor actually owns the project, but typically programmatic management will be delegated to the founders. And donations made to the project will technically belong to the sponsor organization, but they're typically separated into a separate fund that's dedicated to the project. So a fiscal sponsorship relationship is defined by contract, which means that you're going to want to make sure that if you're entering into a Model A fiscal sponsorship agreement, you have a carefully drafted contract, including a carefully drafted exit provision that gives you the option of spinning off the project to another fiscal sponsor or to your own 501c3 organization at a later time. And the advantages of this form of fiscal sponsorship are that you might not have to worry about the administrative aspects to the same degree. The sponsor will typically manage those administrative aspects in exchange for a cut of the money that comes in that's dedicated to the project, usually from 5 to 10% of total money that comes in. So the sponsor will take care of fulfilling the legal, tax, and regulatory requirements. And another advantage is that donations, because they're technically going to the sponsor, are tax deductible for donors. So this Model A fiscal sponsorship might make sense if you have an experimental project, if you're looking to incubate your project and take some time to develop it, or if you need 501c3 status right away, say because you have an important event that's going to raise a lot of funds coming up in the near future and you don't have time to apply as a separate organization. Now, on the other hand, if you decide that a for-profit or a for-profit subsidiary of a nonprofit is the right form for your activity, you have choices with respect to the form of the entity. There are traditional business forms, such as a corporation or a limited liability company, that you can consider. A corporation can be operated for any lawful purpose. The board of a corporation owes fiduciary duties to its shareholders and might have a duty to maximize shareholder value. However, the directors of a corporation are generally protected by the business judgment rule and won't be liable for business decisions that they make in good faith in carrying out their duties. Another traditional business form is the limited liability company, or an LLC. An An LLC can be operated for any lawful purpose, and it typically has more flexibility in terms of its member or owner rights, which are generally governed by contract. Now, an LLC may have a primarily charitable purpose, but it doesn't necessarily have to. A disadvantage of an LLC as compared to a corporation is that they're typically not as attractive to institutional investors and venture capitalists, which tend to still fund corporations. Now, if you don't think a corporation or an LLC as traditional business forms are appropriate for your for-profit entity, there are also some other for-profit hybrids that might be options. The first is an L3C, or Low Profit Limited Liability Company. The L3C is currently available in 8 or 9 states, and the L3C is a form of LLC, but it's governed by statutory limitations that may make it more attractive to private foundation funders, although we haven't really seen this on a large scale yet. An L3C, even though it can only be formed in 8 or 9 states, can actually be operated in any state, so this may still be an option for you if you're not in one of those 8 or 9 states. An L3C is required to have a primary exempt purpose, so a charitable or an educational purpose, and profits or appreciation cannot be a significant purpose of the L3C, although it's not technically limited in terms of how much profit it can make. It also can't have lobbying or electioneering as a purpose of the organization. Now, another hybrid form is the benefit corporation. The benefit corporation is a little bit more widely available, and I think it's available in about 19 states as of right now. A benefit corporation must pursue the general public benefit. It has the option of stating specific public benefits as well that it's going to pursue. An advantage of a benefit corporation, or what might make it attractive, is that the board is actually required to consider not only the shareholders' interests, but also the impact of its business decisions on the entity's employees, suppliers, the environment, and the community at large. A benefit corporation form might also provide some protections for directors. For instance, they may not be forced to sell the company to the highest bidder if they feel the potential buyer won't pursue the public benefit. And then if they refuse a highest bidder, they may not face a shareholder lawsuit. So that may be one form of protection that's provided under a benefit corporation. There's also a movement, although it's not yet a widespread one, towards providing local tax benefits and contracting preferences to benefit corporations. And if you're thinking of forming a benefit corporation, you may want to look into whether your locality provides any such benefits. Another thing to note is that you need a supermajority of shareholders to agree to become or convert into a benefit corporation. The model is typically 2/3 of shareholders, but Delaware requires 90%, and dissenting shareholders may actually have buyout rights depending on the state. So something to be aware of if you're thinking of becoming or converting to a benefit corporation. So a final for-profit hybrid is a flexible purpose corporation or social purpose corporation. The flexible purpose corporation is available in California only, and the form requires the entity to pursue a stated specific public benefit that has a positive effect on any of the organization's employees, suppliers, customers, creditors, the community or society at large, or the environment. Unlike with a benefit corporation, you don't have to have a general public benefit. You can actually state a specific public benefit, and you're actually required to do so with a flexible purpose corporation. Generally, flexible purpose corporations tend to be less restrictive and subject to fewer reporting requirements than our benefit corporations. And this flexibility may make it an attractive option to a nonprofit board seeking to launch a California for-profit social enterprise. A social purpose corporation is similar. It's currently only permitted in Washington state, and a social purpose corporation must be organized to promote positive effects or minimize negative effects on the corporation's employees, suppliers, or customers, the broader community, or the environment. In contrast to a flexible purpose corporation, however, a social purpose corporation may, but need not, specify a specific social purpose for which it is organized. And finally, there's something called certified B corporations. So certified B corporations aren't actually a business form. It's a certification that can be attained by complying with certain requirements. So a corporation or an LLC can actually become a certified B corporation. B Lab is the name of the nonprofit that's actually responsible for the certified B corporation certificate. You can go on their website to see what requirements it apply and what the process is for becoming a certified B corporation. So with that background in mind, let's go through a few specific examples. First, let's say that you want to start a business selling widgets. I'm not actually sure what a widget is, but it seems to be used in multiple examples, so we'll go with it. But say you want to start a business selling widgets and you want to donate 50% to 100% of the profits to charity. Can you form that business as a nonprofit? Now, as we discussed a little bit earlier, the first thing you're going to want to consider is the mission. To be a nonprofit, again, an organization must have an exclusively charitable purpose. Here, it's not necessarily that the purpose is exclusively charitable. If the purpose is to actually sell widgets, even if the money that is raised from selling the widgets is going to be donated to a charitable cause, that's not an exclusively charitable purpose. If the mission is charitable, however, then you want to consider the nature of the primary activities in running the business. Again, to be a nonprofit, the primary activities must contribute importantly to advancing the charitable purpose without considering how income is generated from the organization's activities is going to be used in order to be related to those exempt purposes. Now, if the making and selling of widgets does not contribute importantly to advancing the charitable purpose of the organization, other than through generating profits to be used for charitable purposes, then a nonprofit form would not be appropriate. What if McDonald's wanted to use all of its profits for providing comfort to children and families receiving treatment for serious illnesses? Now, that clearly seems charitable, and I don't think anyone would condemn them for doing so, but it wouldn't make it a 501c3 exempt organization. Now, alternatively, what if the purposes of the widget company were to provide job training to a group of disadvantaged individuals, and they use the business activity of making widgets to do that? Well, then the activity of making and selling the widgets may actually advance the charitable purpose of the organization, and a nonprofit form may make sense. So you're going to need to look at what the primary mission of the business is in order to answer this question. But donating profits alone to charity is not sufficient to make an organization a nonprofit generally. Of course, a for-profit can always make contributions to a nonprofit and may be able to take a deduction for those contributions. So there's certainly nothing wrong with a for-profit agreeing to donate a certain percentage of its profits to charity. And what about if a widget company says that for every widget it sells, it's going to donate one to a developing country? Now, this is actually the Tom's Shoes model, which is a well-known shoe company that donates a pair of shoes for every pair of shoes that it sells. Now again, while it seems charitable, if the making and selling of widgets doesn't advance the charitable purpose of the organization other than by generating revenues to be used for a charitable purpose, such as funding the donation of widgets to a developing country, it's not going to be sufficient to qualify under Section 501c3 as a nonprofit. So let's look at another example. Let's say you have a business that sells XYZ services and you want to spend half of your time providing those services to a disadvantaged class of individuals. Can you form that business as a nonprofit? Well, if the question is whether the existing business can be a nonprofit, you'll need to consider the mission and the primary activities of the business as we just discussed in the previous example. However, there may also be a question of whether you can form a separate but related nonprofit to engage in providing XYZ services to a charitable class, while still keeping the other business activities in a for-profit. The first question you're going to want to ask is whether providing the services to disadvantaged individuals will constitute a charitable activity under Section 501c3. Now, providing relief to the poor, distressed, or underprivileged, such as low-income, minority, elderly, disabled individuals, other charities, or similarly situated persons is typically charitable within the meaning of Section 501c3. Whether the particular activities of this organization will be charitable will depend on how the operations are carried out. For instance, providing investment advice to senior citizens at market rate prices isn't likely to be considered charitable. But providing financial advice to income-distressed senior citizens at free or at prices substantially lower than market rates may be charitable. You also want to consider whether a new nonprofit would result in better or more delivery of charitable services than if you continued to deliver such services through the for-profit that already exists. It may be that there are solid leads for receiving outside grants, donations, and/or contracts that would not be accessible to the for-profit, and that might be a reason why you would want to create a separate nonprofit. But it also may be that it's more efficient to run the charitable services through a for-profit, which may already have the staff, resources, and systems in place to continue offering those services. And again, a for-profit can always provide charitable services without many restrictions placed on it. You also need to be concerned about private benefit issues, which we discussed a little bit earlier. If the business owner, the for-profit business owner, is the sole contributor to the nonprofit, which then uses the money to pay the for-profit, either directly or indirectly paying the owner as well, for services such as staffing, renting office space, etc., then there may be suspicion that the nonprofit is being used to benefit the business owner more than just incidentally, and that a prohibited private benefit is being provided. And there may be substantial penalties imposed on an individual receiving a prohibited private benefit, and possibly on the board of directors of the nonprofit as well. For very egregious violations, the nonprofit could also lose its tax-exempt status. So again, just generally, money flowing from a for-profit to a nonprofit is not a problem. It's not something you generally need to be concerned about. But money or resources flowing the other way from the nonprofit to the for-profit may be problematic, or in some cases even unlawful. In general, if you do have a for-profit and a related nonprofit, there's certain things you're going to want to consider and make sure that you're putting in place, including maintaining an arm's length relationship between the two entities, having independent board members on the nonprofit, implementing a conflict of interest policy with the nonprofit, and using the rebuttable presumption of reasonableness, which is a process that a nonprofit can use in order to create a rebuttable presumption that any money it pays out, including compensation, is reasonable. And if the IRS ever wants to challenge that, they need to actually carry the burden of proving that the compensation or the amount paid was unreasonable. So let's take a third example. What if you want to start a business that employs veterans or members of another disadvantaged group? Can you start it as a nonprofit? Now, obviously, I think everyone would agree that it's great when a business provides employment opportunities to a group that may otherwise face difficulties in finding employment, including disabled veterans and members of other disadvantaged populations. However, merely employing such individuals does not make the business charitable. As with our first example of a business donating its profits to a charity, you have to consider the mission and the nature of the primary activities of the organization. With respect to the mission, you want to think about whether the mission is to produce goods and services to sell to the public, in which case it may not be charitable, or if it's to provide job training and opportunities to a disadvantaged population. What's the primary purpose? You also want to think about the primary activities. Are they consistent with advancing the charitable mission without regard to the production of income? Now, even if the mission and activities are consistent with Section 501c3, a founder may still prefer to form a for-profit under certain situations, such as if it's more critical to obtain equity funding than donations and grants. And of course, if you form a for-profit, you can still choose to employ these individuals in a for-profit business, and it may generate goodwill with the public that helps business as well. So we'll take one final example. What if you're making a film or art, educational software, an invention, or something similar, and you want it to serve the public, but it also has some commercial potential? In this situation, can you qualify for fiscal sponsorship? Unfortunately, this is a difficult question to answer in general, because it's going to depend on the types of creative works and the reason for funding their production, which can vary widely. For example, a documentary about global warming may be made for primarily educational purposes, but its commercial appeal may better spread the educational message and advance the fiscal sponsor's mission. And in such case, the commercial potential of the film may not be a disqualifying factor from fiscal sponsorship, and a fiscal sponsor may still consider sponsoring the film. On the other hand, an indie film that tells a fictitious story focused on car chases, drug smuggling, glamorous locations, and attractive actors, but ultimately has a moral of good triumphing over evil, probably doesn't evidence a primarily educational purpose, particularly if the goal of the filmmaker is to get the most money possible from distributing the film. But what if the filmmakers were a bunch of students from a disadvantaged neighborhood learning how to become filmmakers? Then it might work as a nonprofit if the purpose is actually to provide training to a disadvantaged group. So again, it's going to be very fact-specific, and there are many factors that would be involved in the determination of whether a fiscal sponsor would agree to sponsor the project. Also, I mentioned earlier that the most common form of fiscal sponsorship is referred to as Model A fiscal sponsorship, and it's a comprehensive model. However, in the examples that we're talking about here, many fiscal sponsors will support creative works, such as these, through what's called Model C pre-approved grant relationship fiscal sponsorship. I know that's a mouthful, but basically what it means is that the fiscal sponsor is acting in the role of grant maker to the fiscally sponsored individual or project, rather than having the project be housed internally and actually acting as the producer or conducting the project on its own. Now, if it's done properly, which it isn't always, Model C fiscal sponsorship can minimize the risk of a fiscal sponsor running afoul of the law by acting as a conduit and thereby jeopardizing its 501c3 exempt status. Now, just a few concluding notes before I open it up for questions. In general, you want to make sure that form is following function. You want to make sure that you're thinking about the real purpose of your business and why you're forming it when you're deciding whether to form a for-profit or nonprofit. Think about what your motivations are, how important it is to you to make money, how you're going to access funding and what forms of funding it's important to you to access, and whether you need to have control over the business or whether you're willing to let that be delegated to a board of directors. You also want to think about whether it's the right idea for you to form one of the new hybrid models if you're going to form a for-profit. While you could be a pioneer in a space and you may be able to generate some goodwill, these forms are also relatively untested. They're pretty new, and they may be potentially risky. There's not a lot of case law or guidance in terms of how these forms will work. So with those comments and background in mind, I'd be happy to answer some questions that you might have.
Minutes or so questions. I want to start out with one of them, which is, if I form my business as a nonprofit, how much control over the organization can I have?
So that's a great question, and it's one that we also get often, and that comes up a lot when people are thinking of starting a nonprofit. So unlike a for-profit, which is typically management or investor controlled, a nonprofit is not actually owned by anyone, and there are no shareholders. So there may be a founder who's highly vested in the organization, but the nonprofit doesn't belong to that person. It's helpful to think of a nonprofit as belonging to society at large and being merely entrusted to the directors and officers of the organization in order to ensure that it's operated appropriately and in furtherance of its exempt purposes. So as a founder of a nonprofit, you can be a board member, you can still play a role in the organization's governance, but all directors have the same duties and responsibilities and rights with respect to the organization. So you need to be aware of that and make sure that you're aware of the fact that you won't be the sole person in control of the nonprofit. Now, there may be some options for drafting the bylaws that allow you to have designator rights, such that you can designate all or a number of the directors of the organization, and that might be one thing you want to look into if you think a nonprofit is appropriate and you want to have a little bit of control over who sits on the board of directors. With a nonprofit, you also want to be aware of directors' fiduciary duties that are owed to the organization, which include the duty of care and the duty of loyalty. Under the duty of care, a director needs to be sure to use the due care that an ordinarily prudent person would use in like circumstances, which generally means that they need to ask questions and be informed and make sure that they're exercising independent judgment with respect to the organization. The duty of loyalty generally requires a director to put the organization first, ahead of their own interests, to not misappropriate corporate opportunities, which means if you become aware of something that might be an attractive opportunity for the nonprofit, you need to offer it to the nonprofit before you take advantage of it yourself. And you also need to be aware of conflicts of interest. If they exist, you need to disclose them, abstain from voting on any matter in which you have a conflict of interest, and follow the organization's conflict of interest policy.
Fantastic. Thank you, Erin. I think that was probably a big question on individuals' minds. And I'm going to also pose this question from one of our attendees. I'd like to know about the legal consequences of changing from a fiscally sponsored organization to an L3C or a for-profit corporation.
So again, fiscal sponsorship is contractually defined, so it's going to depend on what form of fiscal sponsorship you're in. But assuming it's a Model A comprehensive fiscal sponsorship, then your project is actually owned or part of a nonprofit entity, a 501c3 exempt organization. So whether it can be spun off to a for-profit entity, such as an L3C, is going to depend on many factors. Nonprofits have a duty to ensure that their assets are used for the exempt purposes. And this includes fiscal sponsor nonprofits. They have a duty to ensure that any money that came in, even if it was for a fiscally sponsored project, is used for exempt purposes. And if they have any intention of transferring those assets to a for-profit entity, they're going to need to make sure that they receive fair market value in return for any assets. So it's typically not going to be possible to just transfer assets from a nonprofit to a for-profit LLC or corporation entity. Now, there may be options with a fiscal sponsorship to transfer a Model A fiscal sponsorship to transfer assets to another nonprofit, such as another existing 501c3 that's willing to serve as a fiscal sponsor, or if you form your own entity and you apply for tax exemption and you get 501c3 tax exemption from the IRS, you may be able, under an exit provision of a contract, to transfer the assets associated with that project to that new nonprofit entity.
And I have to pose this question from an attendee, and this I feel like this issue is very current. I've seen petitions going around. Eric asks, how does the NFL keep a nonprofit status?
So the NFL, I won't spend too much time on this here because it is kind of a specific issue, but the NFL actually is under a separate exemption category. So likely due to the impact of lobbying, the NFL kind of is entitled to tax exemption under a separate category. So it's probably not the best comparison for your traditional 501c3 charitable organizations, but it is definitely an area for confusion, particularly when people see the large amounts of money associated with the NFL and with coaches and players in the NFL.
Fantastic. Thanks for addressing that question. And Laurel's asking, what are the main differences between filing as charitable exempt versus religious exempt if the organization has dual purpose?
That's a good question. So organizations can be religious organizations. Typically, if you're a charitable religious organization, a 501c3 religious organization, then you're required to still to file for a tax exemption with the IRS. On the other hand, if you're a church, then you may not be required to actually file with the IRS, although churches often do choose to, just so that they have a letter actually indicating that they are exempt that they can provide to funders. If you're an organization that just has religious and charitable purposes, though, and you're not actually a church, some disadvantages may be that you might, as a religious organization, you might not be eligible to receive certain government grants. There might be restrictions on whether religious organizations are eligible for certain contracts and grants with the government. It might also be that certain foundations or other funders are wary, for whatever reason, to provide grants to a religiously focused organization. On the other hand, if you are a charitable organization, you may still be able to engage in certain activities that might be charitable, although related to your religious purposes, without having stated that your exempt purposes are charitable and religious, which might help you to avoid any complications with government grants or with foundational funders. Of course, if your purposes really are charitable and religious, there's no problem, and it might be perfectly appropriate for you to state that those are your purposes in your articles of incorporation and in your application to the IRS for tax exemption.
Fantastic. And two questions here that are really probably very applicable to many folks attending the call. We get this question a lot. Can I change from a for-profit to a nonprofit?
That is a very good question, and it's something that I addressed a little bit earlier when I was just discussing the possibility of transferring from a fiscally sponsored project to a for-profit. But if you want to change your existing for-profit to a nonprofit or vice versa, it's generally going to be easier to convert a for-profit into a nonprofit if the for-profit is engaging in exempt activities that would qualify it for exemption under Section 501c3. However, it's important to know that the IRS may be skeptical if a for-profit entity that's been engaging in certain activities is coming to it and saying that they now want to qualify as a nonprofit. So you should be aware of that and be prepared to answer why you think your activities actually qualify you as exempt under Section 501c3. Another option is that you could actually create a new entity, qualify that new entity as tax exempt under Section 501c3, and then transfer assets from the for-profit to the nonprofit. And again, there's usually not a problem with transferring assets from a for-profit to a nonprofit. So when assets flow the other direction, that you get into more problems. Now, if you want to convert a nonprofit to a for-profit, that could be, slightly more complicated. As I was mentioning earlier, nonprofit has a duty to use its assets under the charitable trust doctrine for furtherance of its exempt purposes. And also, so transferring the assets to a for-profit may not necessarily be an option for the nonprofit. One way it could be done is to sell the assets of the nonprofit to a for-profit for fair market value, and then to dissolve the nonprofit if you no longer wish to operate it. But be aware that dissolving a nonprofit often requires approval of the state attorney general or other state regulatory body that governs nonprofits in your state, and that on dissolution, you're still going to be required to transfer the assets, including the money from the sale of any assets to the for-profit, to another nonprofit with similar charitable purposes. So generally, transferring assets flat out from a nonprofit to a for-profit is going to be complicated to do.
And while I'm going to take a second and pose a few more questions from folks, and we do have to wrap up soon, but I do want to also ask folks to give us your feedback on the webinar and the content, and then also, of course, that includes giving us topics of interest for future webinars. So how else can we answer your questions by bringing in guest presenters via webinar?
And try not to hold the technical difficulties against us too much in giving your feedback.
That's right. That's right. You guys, my telephone broke. Can you believe that? That's what was going on there. All right. Out with the old technology and in with the new. So Paul's asking, is it fair to say that the paperwork or regulatory burden and scrutiny is generally heavier on the tax-exempt nonprofits than for-profits?
Yes. Just in terms of transparency, nonprofits are obviously subject to much larger amounts of transparency, and filing requirements are available to the public. So while for-profits do still have, to file for-profit tax returns, and there's going to be other regulations and requirements that apply to them, they are different than the regulatory requirements that apply to nonprofits. And that's part of the trade-off in being tax exempt, right? In exchange for society providing an organization with tax exemption and excluding it from having to pay taxes on its income, there are certain requirements that they need a nonprofit to meet in order to ensure that it's using its assets properly. One of the larger regulatory requirements or paperwork burdens will be right at the outset, which is filing the Form 1023 for tax exemption under Section 501c3. And if you're thinking of launching a new nonprofit, I highly recommend that you go onto the IRS website under their forms section and pull up a Form 1023 just to take a look at it. It's a pretty comprehensive, long form that requires the organization to provide a lot of information to the IRS before it can obtain tax exemption, including 3 years worth of financial projections, as I mentioned earlier, and also an attachment that includes a very long narrative about the organization's past, present, and planned activities and how those qualify it as being exempt. So it's definitely worth looking at, just so you have a sense of what you might be getting into and what the IRS might be looking for in determining whether an organization is tax exempt or not.
Fantastic. And I would say one of our last questions here is from Mina, and I'm going to ask both of your questions, Mina, because they are related. What could a for-profit subsidiary of a nonprofit look like? And what are the benefits or risks of this? And her follow-up question is, what would be easier, starting a nonprofit first, a for-profit first, or starting them at the same time?
Those are good questions. So a for-profit subsidiary of a nonprofit can take on any form that a for-profit could take on. So some of the forms we talked about earlier, either a corporation, an LLC, or some of the hybrid entities. Sorry, Sarah Jo, what was the second part of that first question?
Sure. The second part of the first question, what are the benefits or the risks of this?
Sure. So, sorry about that. So again, some of the benefits of putting certain activities into a for-profit subsidiary rather than operating them internally in a nonprofit might be if those new activities aren't compatible with the culture of the existing nonprofit. So if you're an animal rights organization and you want to engage in some for-profit business activity that has nothing to do with animal rights, from a PR perspective, that might not be viewed as compatible with the culture of the existing organization, and it may make sense for you to move those activities into a subsidiary subsidiary. Another advantage might be if the activities are much more risky than the current activities of the nonprofit organization. So if those activities have a higher risk profile, you may want to actually move them into a subsidiary in order to help protect the parent company from liability stemming from those activities. And again, some of the other considerations we discussed a little bit during the slides earlier are if there's geographic considerations or employee considerations that you need to take into consideration, and whether you need to protect the parent's tax-exempt status. So if the activity that you're going to house in the for-profit subsidiary is particularly substantial, such that it might impact the tax-exempt status of the nonprofit parent, you might want to consider putting it in a for-profit subsidiary, and that could be an advantage. Now, in terms of which you start first, or whether you try to start both at the same time, I think it's important to be aware of that starting a nonprofit is actually rather burdensome, and then keeping it going as a sustainable nonprofit is also burdensome, or it requires maybe more than people initially realize. And again, one thing we recommend is that you take a look at that Form 1023 just to generally get a sense of what might be required of you in order to be recognized as tax exempt by the IRS. So trying to launch both a for-profit and a nonprofit simultaneously might be particularly challenging unless you have access to the resources and capacity that are going to make that possible for you, and the funding to make both sustainable. In terms of only starting one, which one you start first is largely, again, going to depend really on what the mission is and what your motivation is for starting the entities. You'll have to determine whether you think it makes more sense to go with a for-profit first or a nonprofit.
Fantastic. We can't thank you enough, Erin, for being here and sharing your expertise and your time with everyone. We can't get through all of the questions, and we already went over a little bit of time, and I figured that was okay since we got started a little late. But I do want to share another quick polling question with you. And did Erin's information help your decision of going for-profit or nonprofit? We're all wanting to know how this information was helpful, and then a few reminders. You can download the slides and keep this information handy and share with colleagues in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. Remember to do that. And then we're going to share this information as well on GrantSpace, and give us a few days to get it posted. But look at that. Overwhelmingly, people found this extremely helpful. So I also just want to put a plug in again next Thursday, 11 a.m. Pacific time and 2 p.m. Eastern time. You can join us for our next free webinar on a similar topic, Lean for Social Good 101. How can you use lean principles, lean startup principles to get going? All right. Thanks, everyone. And a big virtual clap. Standing ovation for Erin Broderick. Thanks, everyone. Have a great, great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
The meeting is now over. All the participants have been disconnected.